Welcome to the Embodiment podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh. On the show today, Gernot Huber. So Gernot is based in Thailand, very experienced yoga teacher, has approached really integrating mind and body. I caught him on my friend Jay Brown's podcast and thought what he was saying was really interesting and wanted to give him a platform here. So Gernot, welcome.
Well, thank you for having me, Mark.
And you're in Thailand today, right?
I am, yeah. I spent most of my year in Thailand and then also teach in Europe and in the States a couple times a year.
So what was your journey? How did you get interested in the body?
I did a bit of modern dance in college and a little bit of Taekwondo, but I was really more in my head, a sort of intellectual kid. And I still don't know why I didn't encounter yoga. I went to college in California, actually, in the late 80s. But I first really encountered yoga, which has been sort of my real introduction to my body, in the mid-90s in Silicon Valley, working in a software company. And one of my coworkers just asked me one day, hey, am I interested in yoga? And I said, sure. He said, well, I practice at lunch. If you want to practice with me, I'll show you some stuff. And so that's how it started. And I liked it, but I was pretty casual about it for a number of years. And then I went off to grad school in the early 2000s, 2004. I had a breakup, just a lot, moved to upstate New York, had a lot of sort of turmoil. And then I found grad school to be very stressful. In that whole transition, yoga kind of became my anchor. It sort of became what kept me sane. And eventually I realized that, after sort of 4 years of grad school, that it was really the best part of my life. And again, I was sort of in grad school, evolutionary biology. It was all very cerebral. And eventually I just said, yoga is what I really love about my life. Why don't I just do that? And so I did a teacher training in 2009 and I've been teaching yoga full-time ever since.
So it's really just for the love of it. It was just like, okay, this is, even though I'm doing these academic studies, and I know you've studied some, serious academic things, you were like, hang on, this is the part of my life I'm really enjoying. Why don't I just do this?
Yeah, and I think I grew up in a fairly intellectual family, and it always, even though it was never really said, there was this unspoken assumption that my brother and I would sort of become an intellectual teachers, professors, who knows, something along those lines. So when I first thought of in 98, I was in Silicon Valley. I knew I needed to get out of there. I just didn't know what else I might do. And I took a career counseling class and actually remember in that course thinking, why don't I become a yoga teacher? But I'd only started yoga a year or so before. And it was at that point a fairly ludicrous idea. But also I think, like many people, I had an idea of yoga that was, like mostly a physical practice with some really, acrobatic elements. And I just felt like I wasn't really athletic enough. I wasn't thin enough. I wasn't, sort of gung-ho enough in that way. But fortunately, my yoga teachers weren't like that. So my actual real introduction to yoga was much gentler and balanced. And really sort of when I did my teacher training and started, I already had this idea that it's really about mind and body in equal parts and about strengthening the connections between those. And so I actually named my company Yoga Mind, Yoga Body. And that's still the main focus. Like, how can we use the practice, both the asana practice, but also meditation and pranayama, to strengthen the connections between mind and body? And because I think when we do that, we end up having a different experience of ourselves that is much truer and also more joyful.
Yeah. So before we get on to what you're doing now, what was your main training there? I know you've done Anusara, Iyengar? I mean, was it sort of Ashtanga? What were the kind of main lineages you were training in?
I guess I've never really felt myself to be part of a lineage. I've always sought out teachers that I connected to personally, and they just happened to be from all kinds of different schools. So I had a very good Iyengar teacher in San Francisco, Carl Erb, who died very early, unfortunately. My first teacher was an Ashtangi, but I think a fairly atypical one. I had a really good Kripalu teacher in Ithaca, New York. And then I studied Anusara for a while with Andrew Riven and Desiree Rumbaugh. But it felt a little too cliquey. I've always sort of been, I've never been sort of a joiner. I've always been a little bit the odd one out. Like I had to kind of do my own thing. And then actually probably the biggest influence has been Eric Schiffman. Who I didn't meet until 2 or 3 years ago, actually, 3 years ago, I think. But when I left Ithaca to move to Thailand 10 years ago, I asked my yoga teacher in Ithaca if he could recommend any books. And he recommended Desi Kuchar's The Heart of Yoga and Eric Schiffman, Yoga, the Spirit and Practice of Moving into Stillness. And I was in absolute awe of Eric's book, and still am, because he has a way of describing the inner feeling that you can cultivate, or that emerges when you practice yoga in such rich language and such, it's in an honest, beautiful way that is also very, very accessible. And so that had a huge influence on me. And it's a kind of a gentler approach. But I try to balance. I always feel like yoga is at its most beneficial when it is inherently balanced. So I personally feel like a really strong athletic practice is not as beneficial. And at least for me personally, I think I like doing really soft yoga, like restorative yoga sometimes. But if that was my only practice, again, I would kind of feel like that's not as beneficial as it can be.
Yeah.
I'm always looking for the middle ground, the middle path.
Just to highlight a couple of things you said there. First of all, this approach of sort of teacher over style is one I appreciate. A friend of mine was asking, what martial art should I send my child to? And everyone, said jiu-jitsu or aikido or judo. And I said, well, go check out the teachers. Would you?
Absolutely.
That's kind of more important than the style of martial art. Is the teacher kind? Are they going to teach your kid discipline and respect? And are they going to be? Is it going to be a safe place? Say under the umbrella of Ashtanga, there's just a huge amount of different styles and ways of practicing, even with something that has a very specific form.
Yeah. And I've studied with Richard Freeman, and he's a wonderful, gentle, very knowledgeable guy. And I've studied with a couple of other Ashtanga teachers, but again, it's like, it really is the teacher that draws me, and some teachers do and others don't. And there's I think the ones that appeal to me always have a warmth and a sense of humor and a sort of a lightness and a gentleness. And I think that's how I teach too, at least how I want to teach.
Yeah, and I share with you that slight suspicion of sort of culty, clubs that you have to sign up for, and there may be a cultural piece here as well. I know most of my German Aikido friends are very not into the big senseis, as someone, one of my German friends said to me, we tried having an overall chief in charge of everything. That didn't end very well, and I feel like there's a sort of Central European suspicion of the sort of the guru kind of thing.
Yeah, maybe.
And I want to come back to this kind of like what's most beneficial, the soft feeling, gentle practice, or the more rigorous kind of muscular, faster practice. You're talking about balance. So why are both of those two sides important to you?
I think, so again, my starting point is how can we make the practice of yoga more beneficial? And so balance is a huge part of that. Any practice that, and I like to say, if you figure out something that's not helpful, the opposite of that thing is probably also not going to be all that helpful. Like the best solution is usually some kind of middle path. And then the other sort of obvious point that arises is the practice really needs to be adapted to the individual. And actually, really, in fact, the individual, him or herself, needs to adapt the practice. And so I try to teach this, like, teaching people how to listen to their own body and make modifications based on that. So one day they might feel like, oh, I really need a gentle practice today, and then to honor that. And that can be very hard when you're in a more fast-paced class and everybody else is doing, crazy poses and the teacher is very gung-ho. And then another day, they might feel like they need to explore their limits a little bit and maybe even trigger themselves a little bit and see how they respond to that. So I'm not a fan of sort of a really a standard practice, because it doesn't allow, like in Ashtanga is a practice that has a set sequence, right? And there are now more and more teachers that actually allow people to modify it as necessary, and that's great. But if you were to say, no, this is the primary series, you got to do the whole thing, that doesn't make sense to me. And I think that people can, it's a greater chance of people getting hurt. And also, they're not learning how to listen to their body, right? Yeah. They're not really connecting with their body and what their body needs.
Yeah, it's the danger in any form of practice, isn't it? That people follow the form and not the feeling.
Right. And to me, it's very much about how you do what you do and not what you're doing that really makes the biggest difference. But so there's been a bit of a growing trend in yoga towards a very gentle, slower, more contemplative practice, and I think that's very worthwhile. But I wouldn't go so far as to prescribe to my students that you shouldn't do crow, you shouldn't do headstand. And again, then it's sort of the teacher imposing their idea of what it should be. And what I want to do is empower my students to learn to listen to themselves enough that they can figure out what they need. And that's really hard, because mostly, we're very good at listening to our ego, and often our ego is in conflict with what our body needs or what, other parts of us need. And so the big part of it is learning how to stop listening to your ego quite so much and start listening to other parts of you. And I don't want to vilify the ego. It's an important part of us too, but overemphasizing the ego most of the time. And that sort of gets us that creates suffering, really. And so, like, if you have a whole toolbox and you only ever use your hammer, there's a screw that's loose, let me get my hammer. It's just that ego is a good tool for certain things, not so good for other things. It's good for accomplishing things. It's not so good at generating happiness.
Yeah. And I think this is the real $1 million question in any practice, whether it be fire rhythms or biodanza or, a listening to your body yoga practice, is how do we know we're really deeply listening to ourselves rather than just going with a neurotic pattern, or just, like, hey, actually, this person could really benefit for some discipline and some rigor or waking up, but, I'm just kind of feeling lazy today, so fuck it, I'm just going to slop around on the floor. Like, how do we listen in at that level of what's really needed rather than simply pre-established egoic patterns?
Yeah, and that's really hard. And you find, the people who go to the really strong athletic yoga classes, power yoga, are the ones who already have that tendency, and they might actually benefit more from a gentle yoga class. And the people who go to the gentle yoga classes might actually benefit a little bit more from, going to a more rigorous practice occasionally. It's just difficulty of figuring out what you want and what you need, and that they're not always the same. But again, learning to listen to your body is really the best way to figure that out, and it takes a lot of practice. And I just lost my train of thought.
Okay, let me jump in here, actually. Let me jump in.
Yeah.
So I'm with you on this 100%. I teach this in embodied yoga principles all the time. I say, look, people often just deepen their neurosis. They do the style that fits their neurotic egoic pattern. You see this in London. People come in from a fast, hard day at work and they go to a fast, hard yoga session because that's just what feels comfortable to their system. And it's the last thing.
Right.
And the same with the, the yin types who do the yin yoga who actually need a kick in the ass. And so like this is the risk, and obviously the benefit of listening like deeply in is like, okay, what's really called for, not just in my practice over a year, but in any day of the week. I choose a yoga class. I generally do about one class a day or one class on a weekday, and I kind of go, okay, what do I really need today for me in my life today, in terms of what I'm trying to build as a person. And then even in the class, like in this moment, do I need to, I'm going to a class tonight. It's like, do I need to be exact and do the Iyengar thing that the teacher's doing? Or do I want to be a bit more loose with myself today and a bit more free? Because, that's, do I want to hang out in the pose longer and push my edge? Or do I want to be kind of kind and gentle and not support that part of me that always wants to push myself? So that's a moment by moment choice as well, right?
Very true. Very true. One thing that's interesting about yoga to me, when you compare it to practices like Feldenkrais, for example, is that yoga, the way it's been practiced in the last 50 years, has a goal-oriented part to it, and so it can I think really tempt people into sort of replicating patterns of ego and of achievement and of striving and of struggling, rather than just sort of sitting with themselves and learning to be okay with who and what they are. And I think that's part of why yoga is so popular sort of now in the mainstream, because like there are lots of people who might be convinced to go to a power yoga class who would not, lie down on the floor and do some somatic movement, right? And the beauty of the somatic movement is that there are no goals, and so if you're really goal oriented, if you can convince yourself to do such a practice, it'll be really helpful. Yoga, because it has this goal oriented part to it, one thing I do is I keep pointing to that in the practice, and so it can become a little laboratory in which people can learn to notice their own striving, their own struggling, their own achievement focus. And so the simplest way in which this manifests itself is we do all kinds of yoga poses with a really tense neck, right? And with our chin sticking out and like looking up at the ceiling, or looking forward. And that's a clear physical manifestation of wanting to be somewhere else, like wanting to get ahead, getting farther, going deeper into the pose. And so this is actually a huge part of what I teach on a very sort of concrete level. I teach people how to relax the back of their necks, how to stop reaching deeper into poses, and how to sort of put the breath at the center of the practice instead. So that's sort of one example of how I connect mind and body, how a mental tendency, striving, reaching for a goal, has very real physical manifestations. And if you disrupt those physical manifestations, you disrupt your mind's focus as well.
Yeah, and for me, we're so holographic. Wherever we are, there we are. And in yoga, those patterns of all kinds are revealed if we're paying attention.
Yeah. But that's right. As long as you're focused on some kind of goal, then your ability to really sort of notice what's really happening in other parts of your body. If your goal is to reach your hands, to reach your feet with your hands in a seated forward bend, straight legs, Paschimottanasana, and a lot of people think of the pose that way. And when that's your goal, you end up really tensing your neck because in order to make your arms longer, you can tense your neck and slide your shoulder blades towards your ears, and then you're more easily able to reach that goal of touching your feet. But you really lose the essence of the pose. You take yourself out of the moment into this like, oh, if I could only reach my toes with my hands, I would be happy, rather than just saying, well, why don't I just be happy? Whether or not, reaching my toes with my hands really isn't all that earth-shattering.
You don't win.
Right?
Yeah. What medal are you going for here, man? Is there a prize here that I don't know about? But I actually,
Right.
Well, one thing we do is we play with goal orientation with some of these, say, forward, stretches, is actually get people to examine their relationship to goals. Because there are people who don't go for their goals, and there are more people who kind of push themselves too hard to go for their goals. And I don't want to demonize kind of goal setting, and actually, this is something we could really bring mindfulness to within a yoga context.
Exactly, right. And I think I've probably been a bit guilty of demonizing goals in order to sort of make a point. But really, in the end, I think what we all want a little bit more of is a little bit more happiness, a little bit more joy. And we tend to think that external achievement, getting something done will yield that happiness. And lots of research has shown that that's not true.
Yeah, that's
right?
a basic mistake of Western culture, right? Like,
exactly.
You just got the car, or you just got the second series of Ashtanga. It's the same fucking mistake. Is to be like, you just need to get this external thing, and then you'll be happy. So it's just convert that mistake into a somatic form.
Right, exactly. We just replicate that pattern in our yoga practice, and that's again sort of a big thing I talk about. If you want to make your practice more beneficial, stop replicating the patterns you're already doing in the rest of your life that are already not serving you.
Yeah.
And so, one thing is just be in Paschimottanasana, and that seated forward bend, and be okay with wherever your hands end up when you are in a shape that feels somewhat comfortable, where you can still breathe, but you're getting a good stretch, and you're relaxing into the stretch rather than fighting it. It's this the old truism about becoming more present in the moment with a sense of acceptance. That's really all I teach. Sorry?
This is why I reached out for you. It's actually a very simple thing that I hear that you're teaching. You talked about it's not what you do, it's how that you do it, as the song goes. And how is a definition of embodiment, the manner of our being. And I feel like in any yoga posture, stretch, or any movement at all, if people are listening from other arts, we can either be focused on the goal of the movement or the shape, or we can be working on how we do things. So the forward bend can become a practice of patience, or a practice of kindness, or it could be a practice of really pushing my limit. If we're working with the how, then the shape, the yoga just becomes a vehicle for whatever how that it might be useful for us to work on in our lives.
Exactly. And I don't have really good language yet to talk about this, I think, but I feel like there are goals, and then there are goals. They're goals that our ego latches onto very easily. And in terms of the body, those all have to do with the periphery. It's all about, can I touch my toes with my hands? Can I hold my foot behind my head if you're more advanced? Or can I look up at the ceiling in Cobra? They all have to do with the periphery. And so, again, big focus in how I teach is taking, and our brains are really predisposed to paying attention to the periphery. The brain uses a lot more brain power to process data coming from the fingers, the hands, the feet, the face than it does the brain receives lots of data from what the tailbone is doing, but the brain pretty much ignores it. So I try to get people to bring their awareness to their core, to their breath, and I talk about spaciousness. And to me, that's an easy, understandable term that really encompasses being able to breathe. Like, if you can't breathe, you don't feel spacious. And also having a reasonably neutral spine, not overly deforming the shape of your spine, which we tend to do a lot in order not to have to stretch our hips and sometimes our shoulders. But so if you say, well, my goal in this pose is to see if I can feel a little bit more spacious. To me, that's a whole different kind of goal, because it's not one that the ego really latches onto, but it's one that really actually contributes to my sense of well-being. And so you could still call it a goal, but really, even then, I would say it's not about whether you can make yourself absolutely spacious, but whether you can make yourself a little bit more spacious than you were a moment ago.
Yeah.
So that the focus really is on the journey, not the destination.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the interesting thing in the process of doing this, in the process of experimenting with a pose to see if you can make it a little bit more spacious, what you're doing is you're becoming intricately present in your body and in this moment in time in a very real, centered way. And that's the real point of yoga, I feel, right? So this focus away from the periphery into the core, again, to me, is just a very practical, useful technique to redirect people's focus away from the ego, away from goals, into their body, into the here and now.
Yeah, I mean, goals are future focused, aren't they, in that sense, and shapes are other focused.
Exactly.
Yeah. Can't be on yourself here and now if you're focused on making a shape or reaching a goal, because those things just aren't consistent.
Yeah, and when we're so focused on reaching a goal, working a little bit harder to get there, we end up stressing ourselves out, and so again, the neck tension that we create in lots of yoga poses is a component of that, right? When we tense the neck, we get stressed, and when we get stressed, we tense our necks. And so this idea of letting go of your goals, letting go of the neck tension, has a real effect on what's going on in your mind. And so as you're doing that, you're strengthening the connections between body and mind.
What do you do if you need a bit more goal focus? I mean, like, I do meet some kind of, all over the place hippies in yoga who kind of need a bit more of that.
Yeah, I think that's an area where I need to do more soul searching. I don't really know how I feel about that. I got married quite young, and then my wife divorced me fairly quickly. And I heard this through a mutual friend, but she said one of the reasons apparently was that I didn't have a bone of ambition in my body. And I so thought, wow, that's the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me. So I'm pretty firmly, I think, in the camp of let me make the most of this moment in time, and that's what really matters. But yeah, I mean, you have a point, and I haven't entirely made up my mind. But so far for me, I feel like if I just focus on that, if I make this moment count, if I bring my awareness fully into the here and now, in as many moments as I can, with a sense of joy, to me that's where it's at. That's what makes me feel like, okay, I'm this is working. This is a good life.
I interviewed someone yesterday who was in the final stages of dying of cancer.
Wow.
Yeah, it was full on. They said, I want to be on your show before I die. And I was like, okay, cool, let's do it now. I literally did it when I got the email. And it was a real honor, actually. And it was so focused. And they held a real tension between these 2 points. On the one hand, they were like, what matters to me is just presence, like being present for the last few weeks of my life. And presence with my grandchildren who I'm playing with as soon as this call's finished. Just being present. But on the other hand, they also talked about, like what I'm leaving behind, like what my legacy is, the things that the book that he'd written that he was really proud of. And somehow, like in that, with death looming, there was this really just touching and beautiful balance between what you've said and the kind of healthy ambition, as opposed to the sort of, I said to him, no one wishes they'd send more emails when they're in the last week of their life. Unhealthy. I'm about to go on sabbatical, so I get your side of things. I think there's a balancing kind of yang side.
Exactly. I mean, maybe it's sounds like a cop out, but it brings us back to this idea of balance, and I think the people who sort of vehemently defend goals probably are too much focused on that, and the people who sort of argue the opposite side really strongly, well, yeah, maybe they can benefit from setting a few goals. And I do have to say, I really do. I really love teaching yoga, and that is very meaningful to me. Yeah, I'm not sure how that connects, but I wouldn't want to lose that. And yeah, if I knew I was dying soon, that, I mean, it does change things. I've thought about writing a book, and maybe if I knew I had a year, maybe that would motivate me. I'm not sure.
Yeah, like with a gun to your head, another way of looking at this is like, like this guy's dying. It's like, what do you still want to do? And I just got a bunch of money with my dad's inheritance, not a huge amount, but enough that I'm kind of comfortable for a year. We've been doing okay too. And it was really interesting to go, okay, what am I going to keep doing? I was like, yeah, I've still got energy for the podcast. I'm still going to do that. And yeah, I've still got energy for EFC. And people, I haven't got energy for that other thing I was going to do. Is it really, like, it's kind of like having less time or more money. Both of those I find could bring focus in this way. And I feel like maybe we should do a course together. You could do your piece and I could have people standing in mountain pose and shout at them, what do you want to do before you die? There's a healthy balance in that.
Yeah.
And this brings me to something that came up on Jay's podcast. So shout out to Jay's podcast, very good one, Jay Brown's yoga podcast. We'll recommend it heartily to all the yogis out there. This is how I
definitely
a good guy too. And I thought he gave you kind of a bit of a hard time on something that I wanted to give you another go at articulating.
Okay.
He was sort of saying, hard practice, physical practice, that doesn't help your life. It's sort of, maybe I'm being unfair to Jay here, but he was coming from the point of view of sort of his slow yoga, and you were defending the use of the crow pose and the sort of more hard physical poses. So let me put it to you, like, why should we keep some of the more physically demanding poses in our yoga if it's all about relaxing and tuning in?
Yeah, I probably wouldn't use the word should, but I think sort of making a categorical decision that I'm not going to teach certain poses anymore. In a way, I don't think that should be the teacher's decision, but really the students. And the problem is that it takes a long time probably to learn as a student what is beneficial and what isn't. And a lot of people get quite injured along the way. And Jay was one of those people. He had some very serious yoga-related injuries that, are causing him chronic pain. And he came from a very strong asana practice. And I have never had a very strong asana practice. I've always been, I'm not unathletic, but I've never competed in sports. I've never had that drive, I guess, in a way. So for him, pushing really hard, getting injured, realizing, wow, man, that really didn't work. That really screwed me up. It makes sense that he would say, okay, I don't need to go there anymore. In fact, I really shouldn't. In this case, I'm using should intentionally. But that may not be true for his students. And so I think rather than, and we had a little talk, and he says he doesn't tell people not to do those poses, but he doesn't teach them in his classes. Fair enough. I think there's a lot of empowerment in encouraging students to try different things and to notice how those things make them feel, and then make a decision based on that, whether or not those poses are helpful or not. And in that process of trying things and then noticing how they make you feel, you encounter this tension between ego and body. sort of to keep it simple. And so when you're involved in that process of maybe pushing a little bit farther, there are a couple things that can happen. One is you learn where your own boundaries are, so that you can then honor them. And in the process of doing that, you have the opportunity to practice how not to get stressed out when stressful things are happening. And I think that's a really important practice that we don't get enough chances to do. And so Jay and I had a little disagreement, and I think he acknowledges that, and he does something in his classes that I do too that addresses this directly. And it's when you're in tree pose, which is balancing on one leg with the other foot in your inner thigh. We both tell our students, if you fall out of that pose, do it with a smile.
Yeah.
Because that is, you fall. Go ahead.
I just want to underline a few things you've said before you move on, because they're all profound.
Sure.
Like, one here is that by working with pushing limits, you learn to set your boundaries. You go, you know what, this is actually too much for me. And you're doing that essentially with an authority figure in the room, with a certain amount of subtle social pressure quite often. So a good teacher, like yourself, I hope will minimize that. And that's standing up for yourself, listening to yourself, respecting a line. I mean, that's exactly what most people in the modern world need, is to go, you know what, I'm exhausted. I need to take a day off work. Like I took an hour in the park this morning because I just felt into my body at 9 a.m. and just went, man, you've been working really hard all week, Mark. You need to chill for an hour before you interview Gernot. And like that, and setting your boundaries is a vital life skill. And unless there's a possibility of doing something intense, no one gets to practice that. And the place to practice it is yoga, not in life, because life matters and yoga doesn't.
Exactly. And it hopefully is a safe, controlled environment in which you can play with those boundaries without overstepping them. And so I do this intentionally in class, that I get very, very mixed classes. I have students who are 80. I get, sort of young digital nomads coming through Chiang Mai who, sort of power yogis. And I'll not only do I invite people to modify or skip poses entirely, and I don't say it in terms like, oh, if you can't do that, don't do it. Right? But rather, if that doesn't feel like the most helpful thing to be doing right now, then go take a break. And then I'll go so far as to say, okay, we're going to give you an option now of doing this thing, handstand, let's say, and make it very clear. You say, look, you do not have to go do a handstand. And in fact, if you all go and do a handstand right now, I consider myself to have failed in teaching you, because I want to teach you to take that on yourself, to decide whether or not this is the right thing for you. Because as you said, it's such a powerful lesson that most of us are not ever practicing.
And a good teacher, I think, in yoga, or even just an ethical teacher these days, isn't bullying students, or subtly pressuring. It's like, this is the advanced pose, and if you were spiritually mature and not a loser, you would do this one. Like this.
Yes.
I'm not exaggerating, but there's influence a lot of the time.
That is still going on, though, and I think mostly yoga teachers, many of them just haven't really even contemplated this question, and so they're still stuck in their achievement mindset, and then they're passing it on. And so I find this to be very important. And if the teacher simply says, well, we're not going to do any of those poses, then you're taking away from the empowering practice of making that decision themselves.
Yeah, for sure. And that is which is why I wanted to really kind of underline it in red as one of the most learnings. And I also get, I was in a yin yoga class with Norman Blair, who's kind of one of the top yin teachers in London, and there's about 50 people in the class. And he said, only do this pose if you've been practicing for more than 5 years or 10 years. And and then 90% of the class did it. And most of the class were 18, 19 years old. There's no way that, and I could see he's like visibly frustrated with them, and I'm not doing it. And I'm going, all right, okay, whatever. And you could see that it was just implicit in their sort of London-driven mentality to do the most advanced thing because somehow that was spiritually better, or and even when the teachers really tried their best, like that could be in there. So I get why some teachers might just say, you know what, fuck it, we're not doing these poses. But as you say,
so something I'll do is, and the interesting thing is that these striving tendencies manifest even in the easiest poses. So you don't absolutely need to teach advanced poses in order to be able to give people experience. Trikonasana, for example, triangle pose, legs in a V, one foot turned out, and then you sort of side bend over that leg and place your hand either on the floor classically or on the shin or on a block. And most people put their hand so low, even, for some people, even mid shin, maybe too low, that they end up collapsing the front of the chest, it turning into a forward bend because they don't have the hip mobility to do the pose without collapsing their spine. And then they end up tensing their neck to, I think, kind of pretend that they're not collapsing. And so I routinely tell people, okay, now just bring your hand a little bit higher on your shin, slide it up, and see how that makes you feel. And I don't tell them that that's the right way to do it, or I just say, and again, this is sort of a teachable moment. Like I tell my students, do your pose and then change something. Do it a little bit different, and then notice how that changes how you feel. And then you can decide, and maybe you're undecided. That's fine too, but maybe decide, oh yeah, actually, when I bring my hand a little bit higher, I can breathe better. And again, the tension between the ego and the body will become noticeable again if you're listening, right? The ego wants the hand lower. Your breath might want the hand a little bit higher.
The breath is a guide for keeping you honest, right? Like I kind of notice, like, yeah, I'm fine, this is good. And then I'm like, oh, I'm not breathing. Maybe I could do 20% less, that's
absolutely
guides honesty. And you can do this in any yin pose. I mean, like I noticed doing child's pose for the first 5 years of doing it, I was still actively trying to do something in child's pose. Achievement.
Yes.
After 5 years, I went, oh, look at that. There's a subtle doing and forward bend. I asked people to do a hanging forwards bend, and people are still grabbing their toes and reaching for their toes, or just subtly extending into it. So even in quite yin poses, some of these tendencies of striving and pushing oneself can be seen.
Yes, absolutely. And then this brings me to another interesting point, I think, which is that we tend to think, and this has to do with the striving, we tend to think that in order to get something done, we have to do something.
Yeah.
And when you talk about, and that seems so self-evident that, like, why would you even mention that? But when you talk about physical movement, it is actually not true. Yes. Movement is the result of some muscles contracting and other muscles relaxing. And most of us are much better at contracting muscles than we are at relaxing muscles. And the act of relaxing a muscle is actually no act at all. It's actually getting your brain to stop contracting that muscle. We call it the art of undoing, or the art of non-doing.
Yes.
And so this idea, and that's one great thing about yin yoga, is that it just it confronts you with the art of undoing. But I teach this in sort of regular hatha yoga classes, that movement, when it is at its most beneficial, its most delicious, is the coordination between doing and undoing. And it also ends up being more graceful, which is just a lovely sort of side effect. But again, this is sort of a big lesson, and it's there's sort of the microscopic sort of biomechanics lesson, like, oh, that actually worked better if I relax into it a little bit. But it's also a huge life lesson of acceptance, accepting things the way they are, rather than constantly struggling against them when the things you can't change.
Yeah, it's a very natural thing, really. I mean, every time we take a shit or go to sleep, it's the art of non-doing, right? It's like you can't go, I'm going to go to sleep now, It's
yes.
Listen, I want to. Sorry to interrupt a little bit there. Can I just before we lose the thread here, I want to track back to the second really good point you made there before about strong practice, which was that it gives us the laboratory for working with intensity and relaxing in the face of that.
Yeah.
So what I'm most interested in yoga is kind of transferable life skills. And kind of Jay was saying to you, like, hey, I have enough stress in my life. And I was thinking, like, yeah, you do, but do you have a place where you can control and manage stimulus without consequence in a supportive environment to learn to manage that stress better? Because that's quite different from just getting stressed in life and trying to relax.
Yes, that's exactly what I should have said to him in response. You phrased it very well. Right, and I think he sort of feels like he gets opportunities in life all the time to be stressed out and to sort of practice not to. But this is exactly the point. When it's an external stressor in your real life, you have no control over how strong it is. And then if it is too strong, your ability to respond rather than to react goes out the window. And so this idea of, sorry?
And there's consequences in life. Like if you're standing in tree pose and you fall
right,
you can just smile because you didn't just lose your job or your kids or your wife.
Yes. And so if you look at your yoga practice as a laboratory, you can dial in the intensity of the trigger perfectly, so that, again, back to Trikonasana, you put your hand a little bit lower and a little bit lower. The back of the neck, are you starting to tense your jaws? Are you starting to fight the stretch? And then can you notice that and then still relax into it? And if you can, great. And if you can't, then you can back off a few millimeters and then you can try again. And you can't do that in real life situations, right? They present themselves. And so I think, like, learning how to respond rather than to react is a really, really difficult skill that really takes a lifetime of dedicated practice to get better and better at. And so again, like, why you don't have to do it in yoga practice every time, but to me, it's sort of turned out to be the perfect place to do that when I want to do that. And that's where I see more advanced poses to be a useful tool. Like, can I do crows? Crows and arm balance. You're standing on your hands. Your elbows are bent. Your knees are resting on the back, so the elbows and the feet come off the floor. It actually doesn't require that much strength because you're transferring your body weight very efficiently through your thighs into your lower arms. But if you Google crow pose, and your listeners can do that right now, do a Google image search for crow pose, and notice how many of the photos show someone with an extremely tense neck.
Yeah.
And I would argue that's not really part of the pose. And it is absolutely possible. If you can do crow, and that doesn't necessarily mean taking the feet off the floor, but just for the sake of argument, just say that, if you can take your feet off the floor here, then you can also do that with a relaxed neck.
Yeah.
But getting people to that point is really hard. Like, getting people to relax their neck it can be a major aha moment, and it can be a real, like, oh wow. Like, because it is literally an undoing. I have to get my brain to stop doing something it is so used to doing. That knee-jerk reaction of, like, oh, something difficult is happening. Let me stress myself out so I can deal with it better.
Yeah.
That worked 10,000 years ago. That works with physical threats to our well-being, but the stress response is pretty much useless for most of the things that stress us out in our modern lives.
Sure, there's no tigers. I mean, I want to point to the episode with Paul Linden. I mean, to martial artists, this stuff is pretty obvious. I feel like yoga is just kind of discovering it, that, we're dealing with threat in the martial arts as a regular thing, and then calibrating. The key thing is the pressure has to be able to be calibrated, so it can, You know, it's like crow pose in some ways. To me, I'm not sure if that would be the best one. I like to work with lunges and things that can be much more easily calibrated from easy to intense.
Yeah, sure.
You know, Paul Linden, one of my teachers, works with abuse recovery, and he starts off just by throwing Kleenex at people because that's the sort of most gentle thing that can stress.
Yeah.
And for people that have been abused, that's really important that you start really gentle. But so I think like having parts of yoga where challenge can be calibrated is super, super important. And then, you know, the next question becomes like, how do we transfer that into the rest of our lives so it's not just a sort of yoga trick?
Yes. And props be really, really helpful to dial in that intensity. And again, it's interesting that this tension really appears in the simplest poses. I come into, I sit in the front of the class, people come in, and more than half of them will sit down on the floor. And I tell everybody, grab a cushion, grab a block. And most of the people who are new to my class will sit on the floor. Yeah. And they'll be sitting there sort of hugging their arms around their shins because otherwise they'd be falling over backwards because their hips are that tight. And then I do this almost in every class. I tell people, okay, so now grab that block or grab that cushion, sit on it instead of sitting on the floor. How do you feel? Does it change how you feel? And is it an improvement? And then maybe put the cushion on top of the block. And is that still an improvement or is that too much? So yeah, you don't need super advanced poses to teach this lesson. But again, like if you get better at ignoring your ego in the easy poses, if you're okay, and I used to sit on the floor because I was like, hey, I'm a yoga teacher. I should be able to sit on the floor, right? I got to be a good example or whatever. Bullshit, right? I always sit on a cushion or a block because it feels better. It makes me feel better. And even the Bhagavad Gita, 2,000-year-old story on yoga, it has meditation instructions, and they say if you want to go meditate, sit on a meditation cushion.
Yeah, I mean,
because even
around there, jump in. So I keep jumping in because I feel like we're so on the same page here. Like I want to actually have a dialogue rather than just listen, because I feel like there's like some really good meeting points here. And I notice with students how their relationship to taking a block is really connected to their relationship to self-care. And when is offering the blankets at the end, I see this. So some students, it's almost like a subtle, I'm not worthy, or I don't deserve that. And in others, they're like, give me the blanket. It's the opposite pattern. Like, I deserve it. I'm a queen. Give me all the equipment.
Yes.
And it's like, even in something as simple as like with students, I'm like, why would you not take a blanket from me? I'm being paid to help you have pleasure right now. Like this is my job. Yes. And I find even in something as simple as if students will take a block or a blanket to support them, profound things around worthiness and self-esteem and self-care are being revealed.
Yes. Yeah. Shavasana, as people lie down, I ask them if their lower back is uncomfortable. And for a lot of people, that's true. And on the floor puts pressure on their lower back, and just to bend your knees, roll the blanket or bolster or blocks under the backs of the knees. And I always ask, if your lower back is feeling a little uncomfortable, raise your hand and I'll bring you some props. And again, this is hesitation. Like some people are like, yep, that's me. And there's quite a few people who don't raise their hand, and then halfway through Shavasana, they're sort of scrounging around for blocks, and they've decided that, maybe this is a good idea after all. So I like to joke that the blocks are free, the props are free, or sometimes I make a joke that they're not, that block is $1, sorry.
And what
and I try to bring some levity to that, because it is such an important issue. This like learning how to honor your body and to give it what it needs, even if it makes you feel like you're not measuring up or whatever, especially when you feel like you're not measuring up.
And this, I think it's a small example, but it's indicative of how yoga can be used as a laboratory, because you can see can you ask for help in the small way of asking the teacher for a block, for example. And that's the teachers explicitly, hopefully, like you are, saying, I'm here to help It doesn't cost anything. They're using humor to make that even easier as an in. And that is so much easier than asking your wife for something you want in bed, or asking your boss for something you need to support you to not burn out, or asking your friends to communicate with you differently because they're taking the piss too much. And it's like yoga can be that place. I'm really passionate about this. Like yoga can be that place where we can learn a skill that's massively important, like self-care or asking for what we need, in a supportive, safe kind of environment where it's made easy by the teacher to make that little baby step,
Absolutely. And I think one reason yoga is sort of well suited to that is because there is this there are these really strong poses. There are these tendencies and traditions of working really hard, and then there is also this element of softness. I had a student who had a fairly severe neck injury years ago, but she really was unable, even with gentle hands-on adjustments, she was really unable to let go of the neck tension because she was protecting her neck. And ironically, of course, the neck tension was actually exacerbating the problem, but she could not let it go. And then she started going to some Feldenkrais classes, and she's actually doing a Feldenkrais training now. And she came back to my class. She doesn't live in Chiang Mai. She lives in Burma, actually. But she came back, and her neck was much freer. And she said, yeah, the Feldenkrais has really made a huge difference. And I said, great, that's fantastic. And so the point I'm trying to make is there are gentler practices, and they serve a real purpose. Like if you're being triggered too much, you got to back off. You got to find something more gentle, less goal oriented, until you can do what you want to be able to do. But able to do it under more challenging circumstances down the road, then that's also helpful, right? Because it's, again, this laboratory for like preparing you for when the real life, throws a wrench in the works. Yeah. So there's really benefit to the whole gamut, and it's really about I think the student needs to develop enough self-awareness to figure out where they need to be right now. Yeah. How gentle a practice they need today, in this moment in time, on this left leg as opposed to on the right leg, and that's sort of a main focus. I want to empower people to learn how to honor that. And so if I just tell them we won't do any hard poses in this class, then I take that opportunity away from them. That's where I am.
Yeah, no, I'm with you there. And I feel like yoga's gone one way, it could risk swinging. And this is a whole trend, right? So just to be clear, we're not having a go at Jay here. He's a good guy. And it's that trend in yoga. Maybe
and
a little bit the other way.
He absolutely is. And this is a whole phenomenon, right? That when the pendulum is swung too far in one direction, it tends to swing a little bit too far in the opposite direction. I think that that's actually necessary. In order to really find the place of balance, you have to go a little bit too far in the opposite direction in order to notice, like, oh, okay, I've gone a little bit too far now. And at the same time, I have to also say that my practice has gotten gentler over time. My teaching has gotten gentler. The benefits of a gentle practice are absolutely real. And they're not mutually exclusive, right? You can do a mostly gentle practice and add a couple of challenging things that allow you to observe how you react. Are you able to respond to that challenge, or are you simply reacting? Because again, hopefully it becomes a transferable skill.
Great. So we're pretty much on time now, Gernot, which is a shame because I've really swung by. I feel like we've covered some good ground here. There's lots of good crossover there. In terms of finding out more about you, where do people go?
yogamindyogabody.com. And also I'm on Facebook and YouTube and Instagram since a couple of weeks ago with the same Yoga Mind Yoga Body. I actually can't believe that nobody else has snapped that up. But yeah, so Yoga Mind Yoga Body, that's where to go.
Great. And a parting message about the body for listeners.
Savor each moment. Savor each breath.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Mark. Enjoy your sabbatical.
Subscribe to get more. And you can also leave us a review on iTunes, which helps with our rankings. So really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support the podcast even more, then fund us. Go to Patreon. Give us $1 per episode. Those who don't know, Patreon's a really good way of supporting things you want to see more of in the world. I know like so much is available for free now, and you know what I'd say is a lot of energy and effort goes into this podcast. I put it out there for free so everyone can get it. You know, Maud and I work on this. Everyone that wants it can have it for free. And if you want to support us, it is really appreciated. So it's patreon.com/Mark Walsh. And of course, if you want any in-person training, you can visit embodiedfacilitator.com. There's loads more resources there too.
Till next time, welcome home to the body.